You all probably know the 4th of July commemorates the day when the representatives of the 13 colonies signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. By signing the Declaration of Independence, the 13 colonies announced really their independence from England. And the Declaration affirms that there are certain things that we as Americans have, as human beings have, certain truths that are self-evidently named, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That among those rights that we all know of are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so what has happened in our country for the last 243 years is that as Americans, we celebrate these God-given rights, the right to life, the right to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now notice what I didn't say. I didn't say the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to happiness. No. As Americans, we are given the right to life, the right to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you want to pursue happiness, you can pursue it all you want. Good luck. That's really the experiment that has taken place. And so here we are 243 years later in this experiment, and I would say as you look at America and American culture, not a lot of people are really, happy. And the reason being is because, while people have the freedom to pursue happiness, I believe that they also have the freedom to pursue it where it isn't at all. You can pursue that where it isn't and you won't find it. For most of us, there was a time as we looked at our hearts and our lives when we begged God for certain things. As we looked for certain things, we begged God for a better job or for a better salary or for a better house or a better spouse, a family, and so on. And maybe you have those things now and you're not necessarily satisfied. You think, you know what, if I only had this, fill in the blank. If I only had this, then I will be happy. A new phone or a new car or a promotion or a new relationship. And we keep on looking and we keep on looking and yet we're not filled. As Americans, we try to pursue happiness in all kinds of different things, but yet we're not completely satisfied. And we'll say things like, hey, why don't you just follow your heart? Follow your heart. And listen, I understand when people say follow your heart. I understand what they're getting at, but I think that that's bad advice. Why? Because the Bible tells us through the words of Jeremiah the prophet that the heart is deceitfully wicked and just completely wicked and who can know it? You can't know your own heart. And this is one of the things that theologians have been debating over for the last few thousand years. They've been debating over the mind and the body and the soul and the heart. But our advice is, just follow your heart. No. Only God can know your heart. And this morning, Solomon is going to really undercut our faulty thinking that anything here on earth will satisfy. Really, his modern day vernacular, if we're going to look at modern day vernacular, he's going to expose the emptiness of what I would call the American dream. This idea and this thought line of pursue happiness, pursue the American dream. And he will look at all kinds of different things, and his logical conclusion is at the end of the day, it's all meaningless. It's all meaningless. There is no hope, there is no joy in this life apart from God, the Creator, the one that has created us with a reason and a purpose. And so, I've titled this morning's message, if you're taking notes, and I don't want to be too crazy or controversial, but I've titled this morning's message, The American Dream is Meaningless Without Jesus. It's meaningless without Jesus. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the American dream is bad. It's good. Freedom, loving your family, being who God created you to be is great. But if you try to pursue happiness in this life, in this world, apart from Jesus, you will find that many of the things that we as Americans define as happiness ends up falling completely short. And we're going to be looking at 5 points this morning. The chapter 2, verse 1 through 26. We're going to look at verse 1 through 3 in pursuing enjoyment, because that's where Solomon goes. The first thing he does is he pursues enjoyment. Laughter and comedy and wine and all of these things. Verse 4 through 11, he will pursue employment. And he will look at all of the different ways he can work and find joy in putting your hands to the plow. In verse 12 through 17, he will pursue enlightenment and looking for wisdom and education. Verse 18 through 23, he will pursue enrichment and making money and how to get rich. And then ultimately he comes to the conclusion in verse 24 through 26 in pursuing contentment. It's only when you're content in God that you will find complete and total happiness. Now, if this is your first time or you haven't been with us in a few weeks, let me just set the scene so we're all on the same page moving in the right direction. We are in the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes in a series that we titled Meaningless. And the reason being is because that word meaningless is used roughly 37 times in this book. He uses it in the form of vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity, and it's not speaking of vanity where you put your makeup on and so on. He's talking of something that is here one moment and then gone quickly. And what this book is all about is it documents Solomon's mission to really find and or get the hole in his heart filled. And what he does is he looks here on this earthly plane horizontally, just to remind you, he's only looking horizontal. Few and seldomly in this book does he look above to God. But for the most part, he's looking horizontally. And he comes to the conclusion that wine and women and wisdom and wealth and work and even religion doesn't satisfy. It doesn't fill. Solomon is, of course, I would say the story of like the prodigal son. Here was a guy that was destined for greatness, destined to do great things. He was going to be king. He had all the money in the world. He was the Jeff Bezos of his day, the founder of Amazon. He knew all of these great and amazing things, had got education, got wisdom from the Lord. And later on in his life, after writing the Song of Solomon in his early days, where he was in love and praising God for everything, and then he writes Proverbs as he's gained some wisdom later on in his life, and then towards the end of his life he becomes jaded. He becomes jaded because, well, the Bible tells us that his heart turned away from the Lord, mostly because he had a ton of wives and a ton of mistresses that led him away from the Lord. And he comes to this kind of jaded conclusion at the end of his life that everything is meaningless. He's tried everything. He's pursued everything. He's looked for everything on the horizontal plane, horizontally, under the sun. He uses that phrasing over and over again, under the sun. And he comes to the conclusion that it's meaningless. That if you take God out of the picture, your life will be meaningless and futile. And I think Ecclesiastes hits really the thought line that's in our modern day and age, where people are looking to find joy, people are pursuing happiness, people are pursuing better Instagram pages and look at this meal that I just ate, and they take pictures of it, and they're pursuing all of these things that they want, travel and all of these things, and yet so many people in our day and age and in our culture are sad. Even celebrities and comedians, and you look at the world around us, and they have everything that you could ever want, ever attain, fame and fortune, and yet they're dying of drug overdoses. They're miserable and hurting. And that's because Solomon will tell us the reason why. It's all meaningless apart from God. And he'll come to the conclusion at the end of Ecclesiastes. I'll just give you a spoiler alert. Chapter 12. He comes to the conclusion and says, listen, apart from God, this is all meaningless. It's only the Lord that's going to bring satisfaction. And so last week we looked at wisdom is meaningless. And this week I will say the American dream is meaningless without Jesus. Without Jesus. So notice our first point. He pursues enjoyment. He said, in chapter 2, verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth. What does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom. And how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. He says, first and foremost, I said in my heart, I pursued pleasure. What we would call that in biblical terms is the word hedonism. It's an idea or a theory that pleasure is the sole or chief good in life, and you've got to pursue it. It's what Paul was dealing with in the church at Colossal, in the book of Colossians, with the Epicureans, who were these groups of people that were just wanting to pursue pleasure and just wanting to have a good time all the time. He talks about it in the book of Acts as well, in Acts 17, verse 18. And it's this idea or thought line that whatever you do in this life, just go and pursue pleasure. Pursue happiness. Pursue joy. Whatever makes you happy, whatever your heart's desire is, go and do that. Solomon becomes, I would say, like the country singer that gets a bad diagnosis from the doctor and decides to go skydiving, Rocky Mountain climbing, 2.7 seconds on a bull named Fu Manchu, right? And I love deeper, okay? I know a couple of country songs. My ears are bleeding right now, but I know a couple of country songs. You know, and he's the guy that's like, you know what? I went and I had fun. I pursued all of these great and amazing things, and he searched and searched and searched. Warren Wiersbe said that God made life for enjoyment and investment, not experiment. God made man to enjoy life, yes. God, I would even say, allows us and tells us, pursue happiness, pursue joy, and have fun, and love your family, and enjoy a good meal, and you know, don't follow your diet so strictly all the time, and you know, all of these things, yes, pursue and have fun and enjoy life, but when you put all of your hope in those things, that's when we end up in trouble. If anyone could have like the most amount of fun, it was Solomon. This is 10th century BC. We know that he pursued hedonism, pleasure to the max, to the fullest. As a matter of fact, 1 Kings 4 tells us of all the things that he had. 1 Kings chapter 4, 1 Kings chapter 10, 1 Kings chapter 12. 1 Kings chapter 10, for example, says, all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver. And this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. In 1 Kings chapter 4, the daily requirement for Solomon's palace were 150 bushels of choice flour, 300 bushels of meal, also 10 oxen from the fattening pen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep or goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roe deer, and his choice of poultry. I mean, this guy, that was a daily basis. Daily. Could you imagine? 10 cows, 100 sheep or goat, tons of chicken, and if it was me, shrimp and lobster and all kinds of other good stuff. He couldn't have bacon, so he missed out, but, you know, all kinds of game birds and wild game and venison, and Solomon tested life. He looked at it and said, man, I can look at hope and the things here on this earth and laughter and pleasure and fun, and he was like a modern day celebrity. And notice what he tells us in verse 2. I said of laughter, madness. Here's a guy with unlimited resources, so much more than what we have. And he looked at his life and said, you know what, I tried to be the life of the party. I wanted a party every single day. Party on Wayne, party on Garth. You know, that was his idea. Wayne's World? Do you guys not remember Wayne's World? Okay. All right, well, I thought it was funny. And this is his philosophy during this period of life. He's looking at things and he says, I tried comedy. And we can only imagine he brought in the best court jesters or clowns or comedians, and he would sit back and listen to maybe these one-liners and you know, had, you know, the equivalent of Abraham Letterman come to his house and do, you know, his top 10 and all of these things. And he says it got old. It was madness. It was madness. Now listen, I do believe comedy is a gift from God. I believe comedy is a gift from God. Maybe not romantic comedies, but Just kidding. There's some good ones. Serendipity, that's good. But comedy is a gift from God. And I do believe that as believers, we should laugh more. This is why I tell you guys all the time to turn your frown upside down. And if you're happy and you know it, tell your face. Because as believers, we have the greatest joy in this earth, in this universe. We have Jesus. And so, as we look at things, comedy is a gift from God. As a matter of fact, I think there are even moments and times where Jesus was being funny. And nobody really looks at them. They're like, ooh, that's sacrilege. You can't. There's this great book, and I just thought I would share it with you guys. It's called The Humor of Christ by Elton Trueblood. And he goes through and he talks about the humor of Christ, and he says, this is a bold challenge to the traditional stereotype of a somber and gloomy Jesus. And he goes through and he talks about different times that Jesus made jokes. And he used words as a means to make jokes. For example, like when Jesus talks about the log in your eye and the speck in your brother's eye, he was making a joke and using the world around him. So what Jesus was saying was, here you have this guy who's got this log in his eye. And there he is with this log. And he sees his brother with this toothpick in his eye. And he's like, hey man, you really should handle that thing that's in your eye. I mean, that's like, it's sticking out there. There's like some problems. You really need to handle that. I think Jesus was making a joke. Like, isn't that ridiculous? Here's a guy that's got this big old log, and here's this guy that's got this speck. Like, homeboy should deal with the log in his eye. Or when Jesus, for example, uses the thought line of like the camel and the eye of a needle, and Jesus holds holds a needle in the eye of a needle and says, can it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven, so to speak. And he looks at that, and I think Jesus is making a joke. But theologians will try to make it a bummer and be like, no. You see, there was this gate in Jerusalem. And then what would happen is they would get a camel down on its knees, and it would like shimmy itself like a military man in boot camp, shimmy itself on, I'm shimmying for you. And he would make its way through the eye of this needle, and that's what it was. I think Jesus was using a literal needle and saying, hey, can you start at the camel's mouth and get it through? We're going to have to grind that thing up really good, to get it through. Comedy is good. That's why, it's okay for us to laugh. Which is why I tell you guys, don't be a bunch of grumpy pants all the time. And some people find it offensive, which I might not do it in front of their face, but I'm laughing on the inside at them. Listen, comedy is good. As a matter of fact, physically it's well for you. Scientists and doctors tell us that it's good for you. But sometimes comedy can cover up a lot of pain. Sometimes comedy can be a diversion or a veneer. As you look at the lives of people that have lived here on this earth, when you look at the lives of comedians, all the way back to Mark Twain and Eddie Murphy and some of the quotes of emptiness that they felt inside. Rowan Atkins, a.k.a. Mr. Bean. You guys know Mr. Bean? Said, I like walking in the rain because no one can see me crying then. Sammy Davis Jr. died in 1990, made a lot of people laugh, made millions laugh, and he was interviewed in the Los Angeles Times in 1990 before his death, and a part of the article, he said that he looked at his life and it was completely empty. Comedy didn't cut it. And as you look at even our culture and just even all those comedians that have died, Chris Farley, drug overdose, Robin Williams, suicide. Jim Belushi, drug overdose. We look at all these comedians that made us laugh and great funny movies and so on, and yet there's so much pain and sadness. And Solomon would say, it's true, it's madness. Comedy. It's good for us to laugh, yes, but when you place all your hope in comedy, in laughing, in having a good time, and being the life of the party, it's going to lead to madness. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 14:13, laughter can conceal a heavy heart, but when the laughter ends, the grief still remains. Solomon then moves on. You could say Solomon leaves the comedy club and heads to the bar, because notice what he says. He starts getting into wine. Verse 3, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine. Now, I don't know about wine. I don't know much about wine. I know that if it comes in a box, it's bad, apparently. But I do know that there's two forms or two thought lines of what people think Solomon went to. One opinion is that he became a wine connoisseur. And I had to look up the word yesterday. What is a wine connoisseur? And it's a sommelier? It's a French word? Sommelier? Someone hook me up? Thank you. All right. There's a documentary called Somm on wine tasting, and these guys that want to become the best wine tasters in the world and so on. And some people think that Solomon went that route. He knew the best wines to pair with the best meats, or different types of foods and so on. And it could be like the guy in the tuxedo holding the wine and swirling it around and spitting in a bucket, and he tried that. The other form, or the other idea, is that he went to the opposite end and became like a frat boy, washing away his tears in Margaritaville, and was doing that. I think he tried both. I think he tried to be the wine connoisseur, and I think he maybe got intoxicated with wine. But notice what he says. It was also vanity. I tried it, and it was meaningless. It was also vanity. When pleasure alone is the center of life, the result will ultimately be disappointment and emptiness. Notice our next point, he pursued employment. Verse 4, he says, I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards. I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers and the delights of the sons of men and musical instruments of all kinds. And so I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor. And this was my reward for all my labor. I looked at all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed it was all vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Solomon now looks to putting his hands to work. And he's speaking of, listen, I tried all of these things. He gets himself involved in all kinds of projects. And this is something that we hold to as Americans, pursuing your own way of life and your own means of doing things and making a name for yourself and a business and making a record in sales and a territory and so on and so forth. Then it seems that was the pursuit that Solomon went to. He talks about building things. And it's true, Solomon was a master builder. We know that he built the temple, which was spectacular. We know that he built his own house, which took him 13 years to build. 13 years to build his own house. It must have been like on the MTV cribs of that day, just the most spectacular house. We know that he built another palace in the forest of Lebanon. He built a summer retreat. We know that he built a palace for the daughter of Pharaoh, one of his 300 wives. On top of that, we also know he built cities. Spectacular cities. The city of Gezer, the city of Hauser, the city of Megiddo, the city of Beth Horon, the city of Tadmor in the desert. I mean, this guy built a lot of things. And sometimes as Americans, we have a tendency to try to find satisfaction in building and creating and manufacturing and building up a business and a name for ourselves, which I would say there is nothing wrong with that. God is a creator God. We're made in the image and likeness of God, and it stands to reason that human beings would want to think and create. But apart from God, it becomes empty. Apart from God, it becomes meaningless. You can maybe develop a Solomon-type complex of building just for self-gratification. Caesar Nero did that. Caesar Nero, one of Rome's emperors, the saying goes that Nero found Rome a city of bricks, but he left Rome a city of marble. And if you ever get a chance to go to Rome or Italy there, I mean, marble everywhere. It's spectacular and beautiful. He tells us that he planted gardens. He was, going down to Ace every weekend and buying flowers and all kinds of stuff to plant. And it says that he had vineyards and orchards and forests and fruit. I mean, he had a Harry and David's fruit basket delivered to him every day. Notice verse 6, he made pools for himself. One of Solomon's pools was believed to be huge. The length was 420 feet long by 230 feet wide and roughly 40 to 50 feet deep. I mean, this guy built and built and built, and he didn't find meaning in it. It's like another builder I can think of. You probably heard the name of Ted Turner. Ted Turner, who developed and made CNN famous. After all he has built in his life, you know what he said? He said this, that life is like a B-grade movie. You don't want to leave in the middle of it, but you don't want to see it again either. That life isn't satisfying. Solomon had wealth. He had a ton of money, verses like 7 through 9. 1 Kings 8 says that Solomon offered a sacrifice of peace offering, which he offered to the Lord 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord when he dedicated the temple. 1 Kings chapter 10 says that the weight of gold that came into Solomon's house yearly was 666 talents of gold, which I find it a little ominous that it was 666, but 666 talents of gold. Fine metals and treasures and so on. You know how much that is? It's roughly 25 tons of gold a year was brought into his house. The modern day equivalent is roughly $2 billion. $2 billion. And he looks at his life and he says in verse 11, it's just all meaningless and grasping for the wind. Notice he tried music and entertainers. 1 Kings says that Solomon wrote 1,005 number one hits. I mean, I could just see him bringing in like the Philharmonic all dressed up and singing songs and music and Amadeus and, all kinds of stuff. Mozart, I don't know. But as he looked at his life, he realized that there wasn't even hope in entertainment and music. Listen, I believe music is a gift from God. I think it is. Music has a special thing. Christian music, secular music, it has a special way of bringing up memories probably for many of us. And many of us enjoy good music. And we might not always agree on the same type of style of music. But we all love music. It's what theologians can call a common grace. God has given us those things, but music apart from a relationship with God is empty. Think of all the musicians. Elvis Presley, dead. Kurt Cobain, suicide. All these people who have and desired fame and fortune through entertainment, gone. Why? Because music doesn't satisfy. Music doesn't fill us. And Solomon delighted in these things. I mean, he had homes built with Spotify pumping music in his backyard with the winery there, performers, and it wasn't enough. It's like what the great theologian Smokey Robinson once said as he sang, "The tears of a clown when no one's around." And he looks at that and says, man, it's meaningless. Notice the next thing. After he pursued employment, he pursued, verse 12 through 17, enlightenment. It says, then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. What he's saying here is that at the end of the day, whether you're smart or not, whether you're enlightened or not, whether you're a fool or not, the same event happens to them all. And what is that? Death. We all die. Verse 15, so I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this is also vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fools forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As a fool. Therefore, I hated life because of the work that was done under the sun, and it was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind. I won't get too much into this because we covered it, I believe, last week, and wisdom is meaningless, but Solomon really pursued enlightenment. And we know that God gave him great wisdom above all men. And he looks at all of his wisdom and he says, this is madness. And the reason being is because he says, you know, what am I going to do with all of this stuff? It's just going to go to the guy after me. He speaks of, what can the man do who succeeds the king? It's just going to come to the next guy. And that's true. When Solomon died, all of his stuff went to his son, Rehoboam. And here's the crazy thing. Rehoboam took all of Solomon's stuff and squandered it. Just completely squandered it. 1 Kings chapter 11. And so what he's saying, listen, whether you're a fool or you're wise, we're all going to die in the end. So what's the point? It's what the French humanist Voltaire said. I hate life, and yet I'm afraid to die. Solomon would agree. There have been many men and women in the Bible, great men and women in the Bible that hated life. Think of people that wanted to die. Job. Lord, just take me now. Think of Elijah when he had this amazing feat with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and he mocks them, makes fun of them. In another comedy type moment, remember he's looking at the prophets of Baal on the other side of the mountain, waiting for Baal to strike down this animal sacrifice with fire, and he's like, they've been going at it for hours and hours and hours, and he makes fun of them. He's like, well, maybe Baal's busy. And literally in 1 Kings chapter 18 it says, maybe Baal is on the toilet. He's having a Baal movement, you know? He's in the bathroom. Maybe you got to scream louder. And what happens then in 1 Kings chapter 19, after this great and amazing feat, it tells us that Elijah goes into the wilderness and has to be fed by ravens. Why? Because he was so convinced that he was going to die, and he tells God, I'm depressed and kill me now. Listen, as believers, we should love life. 1 Peter 3:10, he who would love life and see good days, let him. Now, there are times when we get sad, and there are hardships, and there are difficulties in this life, and storms and pains that we go through. Absolutely. Absolutely. But as believers, we have a future and a hope. So that no matter how bad things get here on this earth, this is the worst we will ever see. Because we have a hope in Jesus, who's going to get us mansions and palaces in heaven. If it were not so, I would have told you, therefore I go and prepare a place for you. I mean, God is working and moving. And so no matter the pain and no matter the sorrow, as believers, we have the light of Jesus in our heart and our lives. And so no matter how dark it is, we can still glow in the dark. We can still glow in the dark because the light of Jesus lives within us. And yet Solomon looks and says, you know what? What's the point of being wise or being a fool? Yes, being wiser is better than being a fool, but at the end of the day, we're all going to die. So he pursued enlightenment and saw that it was vanity. Notice our fourth point, he pursues enrichment. Verse 18, then I hated all my labor in which I have toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. He's like, I've worked hard, I've done all of these things, and I'm just going to die and leave it to the guy that's going to come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or be a fool? Well, Rehoboam was a fool. Rehoboam squandered all of Solomon's wealth, and yet he will rule over all my labor in which I have toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart and despaired for all my labor in which I have toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom and knowledge and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This is also vanity and a great evil. For what has man for his labor, and for the striving of his heart, with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night, his heart takes no rest. And this is also vanity, or meaningless. Solomon was bummed out, you could say, because he looked at everything that he built up and was like, I'm going to have to leave it to some guy that's going to come after me. It's like the famous bumper sticker that says, he who dies with the most toys wins. Well, actually, no. He who dies with the most toys is still dead. You leave it all behind. And really, that's what he's speaking of. It reminds me of like the rich young ruler, where the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and he says, well, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus looks at him and says, well, you got to keep the commandments. And he's like, I've done that. Done. How many of us could say that? I mean, you just take the top 10, and some of us broke all 10 on the way into church this morning. And yet, Jesus then looks at him and says, well, you know what? Then why don't you just sell everything you have and come follow me? And it says that he went away sorrowful because he had a lot of stuff, a lot of things. I think one of the tragedies that we as Americans face is the fact that we live our lives and base so much of who we are on how much stuff we have, or the kind of car we drive, or the house we live in, or the money in our bank account. Jesus doesn't base our riches on how much stuff we have or how much cash we have on hand. There are no bank accounts in heaven. The only account that will be in heaven will be the righteousness that is given to you by Jesus. So who are you? Are you someone that cares about, gaining all this stuff, or do you find your identity in Jesus? Because that's the only way you're going to have meaning. You can have a great business, but only when you have Jesus as your identity will you be able to stand when that business fails, or when the stock market crashes, or when something bad happens, because you have Jesus. Whether you're rich or poor, smart or not so smart, what profit does it gain a man, or what profits a man to gain the world but lose his soul? Rehoboam eventually squandered everything that Solomon built, and he looks at it and he's like, this is also vanity. What am I going to do? And he realizes at the end of the day, notice our last point, that it's only when you pursue contentment in God. Verse 24, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge, and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This is also vanity and grasping for the wind. This is one of the few times in the book of Ecclesiastes that Solomon looks above. That Solomon looks above this horizontal plane and the pursuit of happiness and everything around him. And he looks above and he realizes that it's only in God that you're going to find joy. Now, he's not promoting this idea of like eat, drink, be merry because tomorrow we die. Kind of this idea that's fatalism, right? That's not faith. But rather, he's saying, thank God for what you do and enjoy God in those things. Warren Wiersbe says, if you rejoice in the gifts and not the giver, we become ungrateful idolaters. And you see, I believe God wants us to enjoy life. The material things that he gives us here on this earth are means to worship him. So we can eat and drink and be merry. We can enjoy our families. We can enjoy our spouses. We can enjoy the work we do or the businesses that we build or all of those things. And we should, because they're honoring and pleasing to the Lord. And in that, we use those things as a means to worship God. Again, the problem is not things. The problem is the value we place on things. Not one of the things that Solomon mentioned here is necessarily evil. Comedy, wine, laughter, gardening, maybe. Labor, architecture, landscaping, wisdom, sex. None of those things in and of themselves are evil. All of those things can be good and holy if we use them for the glory of God. If we use them for the glory of God. So where do you find your worth? And where do you find your value? Is it in the things you have? Is it in the pursuit of happiness? Is it in the pursuit of building things or gaining things? Or is it in Jesus? Is it in God? And we'll close with some wise words from the great theologian John Candy. You guys know John Candy? John Candy, in his movie, Cool Runnings. You guys remember that movie? In the movie, he's the Olympic coach for the Jamaican bobsled team, right? And it's a great movie. I mean, I think it's an awesome movie, part of my childhood. But in it, later on, the coach's dark history, the coach, John Candy, comes out that he cheated in the Olympics by weighing down the bobsled and bringing disgrace to himself and the team. And one of the bobsledders from Jamaica, Doris, asked him, why did he cheat after winning 2 gold medals? And John Candy said this in the movie, if you are not enough without it, you will never be enough with it. And isn't it strange? The more you run after life, the more you seek the pleasures of life, the less you find. The more it takes from you. The more it seems to eat you up. Even the trials and the heartaches and the hard times that others seek to avoid are touched with the blessings of heaven that seem to minister to our hearts when we realize and understand that God has a reason and a purpose in it. Solomon's search for the meaning of life really comes down to looking at it through the horizontal plane. If you're not enough without it, you'll never be enough with it. And for the believer, we believe we're enough because Jesus loves us. We're enough because we're identified in Jesus. And so pursuing happiness isn't necessarily evil, and looking at all those things aren't bad. It's not. If you do it without Jesus, though, it is. Because you'll only find peace and satisfaction in this life with Jesus. As we close, 2 things to take from this morning's message, personal applications to apply to our heart and our life, and then the worship team will come and lead us. Number 1, we need to remember that a good thing turned into a God thing becomes enslaving. A good thing turned into a God thing becomes enslaving. When we place all of our hope and all of our trust in things, and they become the prominent and or most primary thing in our lives, then we become slaves to those things. And the point that Solomon is making out is that he indulged in every desire he saw, all the ups, all the downs, the good and the bad in his efforts, and he came to the conclusion that it was all meaningless. And so we have to ask the question ourselves personally, in our minds, I will be happy when fill in the blank. Because Solomon, through the Holy Spirit, gives us this book inspired by God and says, you know what? It will not work. Whatever that fill in the blank is, if it's not Jesus. And we might think if we just have the American dream, everything will be different, I'll be happy. But when you get it, you're not happy. You want the state championship. Well, guess what? Someone's going to win it next year. You want the raise. You want the new car. But then that car starts breaking down over time. You want the nicer house. But then the hot water heater breaks and floods the basement, and now it's a problem. All those things fade, and Solomon warns us about indulging in these things. Like I said, listen, none of these things that he mentions are necessarily bad or evil. The problem is when we turn a good thing into a God thing, that it becomes the most important things to us, and it ends up enslaving us. And we live by them and die by them. It's like the famous quote of a boat owner. The happiest day of a boat owner's life is when he buys the boat and then sells it. Why? Because all the maintenance and insurance and work in the middle is difficult. These things cannot become ultimate in our lives. And so if we're pursuing these things, we need to remember that they're not going to bring happiness. Only pursuing Jesus will. And number 2, and we'll close with this, everything ultimately is meaningless without Jesus. Solomon's life in so many ways reminds me of the prodigal son, and so many people think that the prodigal son's problem was that he went to a far-off country and he partied too much. That's what we always say. Oh, he went to a far-off country and he partied too much, and he came to his senses, and he wanted to leave the party behind and go home. But don't you remember the story? The story begins with him going to parties, but then it ends with a massive party. The father brings out the best lamb and has a party for his son. Yes, there was a party in a far-off country that leaves the son broken, but there's an epic party when he gets back, and there's dancing and singing. The difference is that the son couldn't enjoy the party rightly until he was satisfied in the Father's love. And that's the gospel. This life is a blessing, and it's good, and it's awesome. And we have amazing blessings of living in a country where we can pursue freedoms and happiness and all of those things, and I love it. But for us to be satisfied in this life, you will only be satisfied in Jesus Christ and his love, in the Father's love. Enjoy this life. Enjoy your family, your spouses, your marriage. Enjoy your works. Laugh a little bit more. Yes, gardening is good for the soul, and building things and many things that pursuits as God intended, but only when we're satisfied in the Creator God will we be completely whole. As C.S. Lewis puts it, our problem is not that we desire too much, it's that we settle for too little. God wants to offer us Dave and Buster's, and we're content with Chuck E. Cheese, And we're eating cardboard pizza at Chuck E. Cheese when God is offering us filet mignon at Elway's, Amen. If you're paying. It's only when we're satisfied in Jesus. And I'll close with this. Psalm 16 says this: "Keep me safe, O God, for I have come to you for refuge. And I said to the Lord, you are my master, and every good thing I have comes from you. The godly people in the land are my true heroes, and I take pleasure in them. And troubles multiply for those who chase after other gods. I will not take part in their sacrifices of blood or even speak the names of their gods. Lord, you alone are my inheritance, my cup of blessing. You guard all that is mine. The land you have given me is a pleasant land. What a wonderful inheritance. And I will bless the Lord who guides me. Even at night my heart instructs me, and I know the Lord is always with me. I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me. No wonder my heart is glad and I rejoice, for my body rests in heaven. For you will not leave my soul amongst the dead or allow your Holy One to rot in the grave. You will show me the way of life, granting me the joy of your presence and the pleasures of living on this earth with you forever." It's okay to have happiness and pursue pleasure, but it's only in Jesus that you will find completeness and wholeness, because everything apart from Jesus is meaningless. Let's pray. Heavenly Father,